The Village Raid. The film opens in a West African coastal village. Amora, a young woman in her early 20s, is laughing with her family, helping her mother cook. Suddenly, shouts echo from the outskirts, followed by the thunder of approaching horses. Amora's joy turns to horror as slave traders storm the village, capturing her and dozens of others. Amid the chaos, families are torn apart, and Amora is shackled, her face etched with terror and disbelief. The scene ends with her being led to the shore, where slave ships wait. Thomas Clarkson's mission. Across the sea in England, Thomas Clarkson, a passionate abolitionist, addresses a small crowd in a smoky pub. He speaks about the horrors of the slave trade, sharing testimonies he has gathered from former slaves and sailors who witnessed the brutality. As he speaks, we see his intensity, his desperation for people to understand the cost of human lives. Clarkson knows that if he can convince the public, he might sway Parliament. The scene ends with Clarkson setting off on a journey to gather more evidence, determined to show the truth. Kwame's dilemma. In a West African kingdom, Chief Kwame sits in his palace, surrounded by advisors and European traders. The traders offer guns and goods in exchange for captives, pushing him to continue the trade. Kwame is visibly torn. He has benefited from the trade, but he sees how it devastates his people and destabilizes neighboring tribes. As the traders argue their case, Kwame's eyes harden, but he remains silent, his conflict palpable. It ends with Kwame dismissing them, brooding over his growing sense of guilt. Amora's escape. Amora is held in a dark, crowded cell near the shore with other captives, chained and frightened. That night, she notices a small, rusty nail on the ground and manages to pick the lock on her shackles. Whispering to others, she leads a handful of captives in a daring escape, slipping past sleeping guards and disappearing into the forest. The scene is tense, with close-ups of their faces filled with fear and hope. By morning, they've reached the safety of a neighboring village that opposes the slave trade. They collapse, exhausted but free. Clarkson's growing movement. Clarkson arrives in London, tired but determined, and meets with abolitionist allies. Among them are former slaves who share their stories in public meetings. Clarkson organizes marches, petitions, and public demonstrations, showing evidence of the inhumanity of the trade, sketches of slaves in chains, models of overcrowded ships. The scene shows the crowd reacting with horror, some even weeping. Clarkson knows he's making an impact, but the powerful trading interests push back fiercely. He vows to continue, even as his health suffers and threats against him grow. Kwame's decision. After witnessing another village raided by slave traders, Kwame's internal struggle reaches a breaking point. He speaks with elders who urge him to abandon the trade, emphasizing the long-term devastation it will bring to their people. In a symbolic scene, Kwame stands by the ocean, watching as a slave ship sails away. The camera lingers on his face, reflecting his resolve. He returns to his palace and informs his advisors of his decision. Their kingdom will no longer participate in the trade. His words shock the court, but he remains firm, despite the economic sacrifice. Amora's rising leadership. In the village that gave her sanctuary, Amora trains with others in combat and strategy, her once gentle demeanor now replaced with determination. She becomes a leader, rallying communities to protect their people. News of her courage spreads, and more people join the resistance. The scene cuts to her organizing raids on slave trading posts, freeing captives and dismantling the infrastructure of the trade. Her bravery and resolve ignite a wave of resistance that reverberates across the region. Clarkson's battle in Parliament. Clarkson, pale and thin from his efforts, presents his case to Parliament, using all the evidence he's gathered. He speaks passionately, his voice filled with urgency, recounting the brutality of the slave trade. Some members listen, others scoff, but he presses on. When he finishes, there is silence, a moment of tension as lawmakers weigh the stakes. Clarkson receives a standing ovation from his supporters, but he knows the fight isn't over. The scene ends with him meeting privately with sympathetic members of parliament, urging them to push for a bill to abolish the trade. Kwame's alliance. Kwame meets with chiefs from neighboring tribes, some of whom are still participating in the slave trade. He persuades them to join his stand against it, arguing that their unity is the only way to end the traders' hold over them. Some chiefs resist, while others agree, influenced by Kwame's vision of a stable future where their people thrive without selling their own. The scene ends with a group of chiefs symbolically shaking hands, a promise to each other and their people. The revolt at the slave port. Amora leads a raid on a major slave trading port. The scene is intense, filled with swift, stealthy movements as they dismantle the holding cells and free hundreds of captives. Clashes with guards ensue, with Amora narrowly escaping death several times. She fights with unmatched ferocity, driven by memories of her village's destruction. As the dawn breaks, the port is left in ruins, and Amora stands tall, her face lit by the rising sun, a symbol of hope and freedom. The passage of the abolition bill. Clarkson, exhausted but hopeful, watches from the gallery as Parliament finally debates the abolition of the Slave Trade Act. Supporters speak passionately, their voices interspersed with clips of Amora leading her people and Kwame standing resolutely by his decision. The tension builds until, at last, the vote is called. With a dramatic pause, the act is passed, and Clarkson's face breaks into a weary smile, realizing that his years of struggle were worth it. He leaves Parliament, receiving the thanks and admiration of his allies and those he's helped. The new future. Kwame surveys his kingdom, now shifting from a slave-based economy to trade in goods like ivory and spices. His people are healthier, their villages rebuilding, and children play freely in the fields. Kwame's face is filled with quiet satisfaction as he watches his people thrive, knowing he has protected their future. Amora's legacy. Amora's village and other liberated communities grow stronger, forming a coalition against the slave trade. She leads them with unwavering strength, inspiring others to join the fight against any remaining trading post. Her courage and leadership have given the people a sense of pride and purpose, and the region begins to heal. In a final moment, she looks to the horizon, where the slave ships once sailed, and turns away, symbolizing a new era of freedom. Epilogue: The Ripple of Freedom. The closing montage shows the global impact of these efforts, anti-slavery movements blossoming in other countries, the end of the transatlantic trade, and liberated African communities rebuilding. Clarkson, Amora, and Kwame have each played a vital role in ending one of humanity's darkest chapters. The final scenes highlight how their courage, sacrifice, and unity sowed the seeds for broader struggles for equality and justice across the world. Inspired by true events, Freedom Tides pays homage to the countless individuals and communities whose courage and resolve ended the transatlantic slave trade, paving the way for freedom and equality across generations. This story encapsulates the immense courage, perseverance, and unity that were necessary to bring an end to the African slave trade. Each scene underscores the impact of personal choices and collective action in shaping history.